The anchor weighed 60 pounds. That's what they used. Not a gun, not a knife. A rusted iron anchor, heavy enough to drag two people straight to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Tom Hawks felt the cold metal chains wrap around his wrists. His wife Jackie sat beside him on the deck of their own yacht, blindfolded, gagged, trembling. Somewhere in the distance, the California coastline had disappeared hours ago. Now there was only water, endless black water. The young man standing over them had seemed so charming just days before. He'd brought his pregnant wife. He'd brought his infant daughter. He'd smiled and asked all the right questions about the boat they'd spent their life savings on. Now that same man was tying them to an anchor. Jackie was crying through her gag. Tom could hear her muffled sobs, and even with his hands bound, he reached out to touch her fingers. One last gesture of comfort. One final reminder that they were together. The young man picked up the anchor, and then Tom Hawks, a retired probation officer who'd spent 20 years helping criminals rehabilitate, watched in horror as the person he'd tried to help threw that anchor overboard. The chain went taut, and in an instant, Tom and Jackie Hawks were dragged off the deck of the Well-Deserved and into the freezing Pacific depths. They were still alive when they hit the water. To understand how evil found Tom and Jackie Hawks, you first have to understand what they had built together. Tom was not a man who believed in shortcuts. He'd served in Vietnam. He'd raised two sons as a single father after his first marriage ended. He'd worked for 2 decades as a probation officer in Arizona, a job that required patience, empathy, and an unshakable belief that people could change. By his mid-50s, Tom had earned something most people only dream about: freedom. He'd saved carefully his entire life. He invested in property when others were spending. He lived frugally when his colleagues bought flashy cars. And when he met Jackie O'Neill, a warm, down-to-earth woman who shared his love of adventure, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. They would live on a boat, not just any boat, a 55-foot trawler yacht with teak decks and brass rails, a floating home that would carry them wherever the wind took them. When they found her docked in Newport Beach, California, they couldn't believe the name already painted on her hull. Well-deserved. It was perfect, because that's exactly what this dream was. For 2 glorious years, Tom and Jackie sailed up and down the Pacific coast. They explored the Sea of Cortez. They anchored off Catalina Island and watched the sunset melt into the ocean. Jackie would cook in the galley while Tom lifted weights on deck, keeping his body strong even as he finally allowed himself to relax. Their friends described them as the happiest couple they'd ever known. 2 people who had found each other later in life and refused to waste a single moment of the time they had left. Then came the phone call that would change everything. Tom's son Matt and his wife were expecting a baby. Tom was going to be a grandfather. Jackie was overjoyed. Even though the baby wouldn't technically be hers by blood, she'd helped raise Matt since he was a teenager. This grandchild would be their grandchild. And suddenly, the endless horizon didn't seem as appealing as tiny fingers and first steps and birthdays in the backyard. They made the decision together. They would sell the Well-Deserved. They would buy a house near Matt in Arizona. They would trade their adventure for something even better: family. In November 2004, they placed an advertisement in a boating magazine. The asking price was $435,000. Within days, someone responded. The young couple who came to see the yacht seemed almost too good to be true. Skylar De Leon was 25 years old, clean-cut and charming. He told Tom he was a former actor. He'd appeared on Mighty Morphin Power Rangers as a kid and done some commercials. He said he'd made good money and invested it wisely. His wife Jennifer was beautiful and visibly pregnant with their second child. And when she showed up to the second meeting with their infant daughter Haley in her arms, Jackie Hawks' heart melted immediately. Here was a young family just starting out. Here was everything Jackie loved: youth, hope, new beginnings. But Tom wasn't entirely convinced. He'd spent 2 decades reading people. He'd interviewed hundreds of criminals. He'd learned to trust his instincts about who was dangerous and who wasn't. Something about Skylar De Leon didn't sit right. The young man seemed nervous. His story about being a wealthy former child star didn't quite match his appearance. And when Tom asked pointed questions about financing, Skylar's answers were vague. But then Jennifer arrived with the baby, and Skylar talked about wanting to give his daughter the same kind of adventures Tom and Jackie had experienced. And Jackie started gushing about her own grandchild on the way. The suspicion faded. Tom decided he was being paranoid. Not everyone with a checkered past was dangerous. He of all people should know that. He'd spent his career believing in second chances. A test cruise was scheduled for November 15, 2004. What Tom Hawks didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the charming young man asking about engine specifications had already murdered once before. And he was about to do it again. The truth about Skylar DeLeon was far darker than anyone could have imagined. His real name wasn't even Skylar. He was born John Julius Jacobson Jr., named after a father who would spend the next 2 decades systematically destroying him. John Jacobson Sr. was a drug dealer. Cocaine, methamphetamine. The family home was a revolving door of addicts and criminals. Money would appear in stacks on the kitchen counter, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and then disappear just as quickly. When Jacobson Sr. wasn't dealing drugs, he was abusing his son. The details that emerged years later were horrific. Beatings for minor infractions, sexual abuse that began when Skylar was barely old enough to remember, and a particularly sadistic form of torture, shoving toothpicks under the boy's fingernails whenever he did something wrong. By the time Jacobson Sr. went to federal prison on drug trafficking charges, young Skylar was already broken in ways that would never fully heal. He did land a few acting jobs, mostly commercials, plus a brief appearance as an extra on Power Rangers. But it was never enough to build a career. He joined the Marines and went AWOL after 15 days. He bounced from job to job, never sticking with anything. And somewhere along the way, something inside him went dark. When he met Jennifer Henderson online, he saw an opportunity. She was beautiful, ambitious, and willing to overlook his shortcomings. They got married. They had a daughter. They moved into a converted garage behind Jennifer's parents' house. But they wanted more. They wanted the life that had been denied to them. The big house, the boat, the fairy tale. In December 2003, nearly a year before he would encounter Tom and Jackie Hawks, Skylar DeLeon got a taste of just how easy it could be to take what he wanted. He was serving time in a minimum security jail for a burglary conviction, but the facility allowed inmates to work during the day. That's where he met John Jarvie. Jarvie was a middle-aged man with $50,000 in cash he'd raised by refinancing his condo. He was looking for a good investment opportunity. Skylar told him he had the perfect deal waiting in Mexico. Jarvie drove down to Baja with Skylar on December 27, 2003. He never came back. His body was found on the side of a highway near Tecate. His throat had been slit from ear to ear. The $50,000 was gone. Mexican authorities couldn't make a case. The murder remained unsolved. Skylar DeLeon had discovered something about himself that day. Something terrible. He didn't feel anything when he killed. No guilt, no remorse, no hesitation. Just the cold satisfaction of taking what he wanted. November 15, 2004, a crisp autumn morning in Newport Beach. Tom and Jackie Hawks woke up early to prepare the well-deserved for the test cruise. They'd said goodbye to their friends just days before, celebrating their final voyage with the people who loved them. The boat was packed with memories, home videos, photo albums, Jackie's favorite spices still arranged in the galley. Soon it would belong to someone else. Skylar DeLeon arrived around 3:30 in the afternoon. He wasn't alone. He introduced the 2 men with him as his accountant and a friend. The accountant was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, not the president, but a 40-year-old former gang member from the Long Beach Insane Crips. He had 21 arrests on his record, including attempted murder. He'd been recruited that very morning. The friend was Alonzo McCain, a 19-year-old kid who'd worked as a guard at the jail where Skylar served time. He was in over his head and had no idea what was about to happen. Tom Hawks looked at the 3 men and felt that old instinct flare up again. These didn't look like yacht buyers. The accountant was massive, intimidating. The friend seemed nervous. And Skylar was smiling just a little too widely. But the paperwork was ready. The deal was done. One last cruise, and they could start their new life in Arizona. The well-deserved left Newport Harbor and headed toward the open Pacific. Jackie made a phone call to a friend at 4:06 p.m. It would be her last. A week passed, then another. Tom and Jackie Hawks had completely disappeared. Their son Ryan wasn't worried at first. His father had mentioned taking one last trip to Catalina. Maybe they'd extended the voyage. Maybe they were savoring their final days on the water. But when Ryan called his father's cell phone, it went straight to voicemail. Same with Jackie's phone. That was strange. Tom and Jackie never turned off their phones. Ryan reached out to his uncle Jim Hawkes, a retired police chief. Jim drove down to Newport Beach to check on the boat. What he found made his blood run cold. The Well-Deserved was still there, docked in its usual spot. The keys were aboard. Jackie's personal belongings were still scattered throughout the cabin. Tom's weights were still bolted to the deck. But Tom and Jackie were gone. Jim noticed something else. The dinghy they used to reach the yacht hadn't been tied properly. The motor was still lowered into the water. Small details, maybe. But Jim had been a cop for decades. He knew what a crime scene looked like. He made some calls. Someone told him the boat had been sold to a young couple named Delian. He dialed the number. A woman answered. Jennifer Delian. She explained that yes, they'd purchased the boat. Her husband Skylar had paid the Hawks in cash, $485,000 in a briefcase, and watched them drive away in their Honda CR-V. But she couldn't explain where they'd gone after that. Jim Hawkes hung up the phone and called the police. A missing persons investigation had officially begun. Detective Dave Byington of the Newport Beach Police Department took the case. From the first interview, something felt wrong. Skylar Delian came in willingly. He was calm, cooperative, even friendly. He produced sales documents that appeared legitimate, signed by Tom and Jackie, notarized by a witness complete with fingerprints. But his story had holes you could sail a yacht through. He claimed he'd paid nearly $500,000 in cash. Where did that money come from? Skylar admitted, almost proudly, that it was drug money he'd been laundering. He said he wanted to go straight for his family. Byington ran the young man's record. Prior conviction for armed burglary. Currently on probation. This was not the profile of someone with $500,000 in legitimate cash. The detective searched the Well-Deserved and found something peculiar. A receipt from Target, dated November 17, 2004. 2 days after the Hawks supposedly sold the boat and drove away. The receipt was for cleaning supplies. Bleach, rubber gloves, trash bags. Byington knew exactly what those items were used for. Then came the breakthrough. The Hawks' silver Honda CR-V was found in Mexico, parked outside a mobile home. The owner said a young American couple had left it there. Mexican authorities had more news. A detective named Joe Bahina was investigating an unsolved murder from nearly a year earlier. A man named John Jarvie, who'd been found with his throat cut near Tecate. Jarvie had known Skylar Delian. They'd served time in the same jail. Suddenly, the Newport Beach detective wasn't just looking at a missing persons case anymore. He was looking at a serial killer. Everything hinged on one person, the notary public who had witnessed the sale documents. Her name was Kathleen Harris, and when detectives first interviewed her, she stuck to Skylar's story. She claimed she'd been at the dock. She'd watched Tom and Jackie sign the paperwork. Everything was legitimate. But when Byington asked her to describe the Hawks, she stumbled. Harris couldn't remember what Tom looked like. Couldn't describe Jackie. She got basic details wrong. Details anyone who'd actually met the couple would have known. Byington pressed harder, the pressure built, and then Harris cracked. She admitted she'd never seen Tom and Jackie Hawks. She'd never been on the boat. Jennifer DeLeon had paid her $2,000 in cash to backdate the documents and lie to police. But Harris wasn't the key witness. The real break came from the 19-year-old kid who'd been along for the ride. Alonzo McChain had fled to Mexico after the murders, but guilt was eating him alive. When he returned to California, detectives were waiting. What he told them over the next several hours would haunt everyone who heard it. McChain described everything. He said Skylar Delian had approached him weeks earlier with an incredible story. Skylar claimed to be a wealthy international assassin with ties to Mexican drug cartels. He said he had a contract on a couple who owned a yacht, and he needed help executing it. It was all lies, of course, but McChain was 19, naive and dazzled by the fantasy. On November 15th, they boarded the Well-Deserved with John F. Kennedy providing the muscle. Once the yacht was far enough from shore, the attack began. Kennedy feigned seasickness and went below deck. When Tom Hawks came to check on him, Kennedy, a former gang enforcer, put him in a chokehold. Skylar joined in, striking Tom with a weapon. Above deck, McChain overpowered Jackie with a taser. She was small, terrified, no match for 3 grown men. The couple was handcuffed, blindfolded, gagged, dragged into the cabin. Then Skylar forced them to sign over everything: the boat, their bank accounts, power of attorney. Tom and Jackie complied, hoping cooperation might save their lives. It wouldn't. Machen described what happened next with tears streaming down his face. Jackie was crying, begging. She kept saying the same thing over and over, her words muffled by the gag. "Please let me see my grandson. Please, I just want to see my grandson." Tom couldn't speak through his gag, but he reached out with his bound hands and found Jackie's fingers. He held onto her, squeezed, let her know he was there. Skylar Delian tied them both to the yacht's anchor. Tom knew what was coming. Even blindfolded and bound, the former probation officer wasn't going quietly. He kicked out with everything he had, landing a blow to Skylar's groin that dropped him to the deck. It wasn't enough. John F. Kennedy stepped in and struck Tom so hard in the head that he lost consciousness. Skylar picked up the 60-pound anchor and threw it overboard. The chain snapped taut. The couple was yanked across the deck and over the side of their own boat. They disappeared beneath the surface, still tied together, still holding hands. The trials that followed were devastating. Jennifer DeLeon was convicted first in 2006. She had helped plan the murders, used her own baby to gain the Hawks' trust, and never showed a single sign of remorse. When details of the crime were read aloud in court, she laughed. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Skylar Delian's trial came in 2008. His attorney didn't even try to claim innocence. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, he argued that Skylar's horrific childhood should spare him from the death penalty. The jury disagreed. Skylar Delian was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder: Tom Hawks, Jackie Hawks, and John Jarvie, and sentenced to death. John F. Kennedy, the gang enforcer who had provided the muscle, was also sentenced to death. Alonzo McChain, in exchange for his testimony, pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He served his sentence and was paroled in 2021. The bodies of Tom and Jackie Hawks have never been recovered. Years later, in a prison interview, Skylar Delian was asked how he felt about what he'd done. His answer was chilling. "I've never really felt evil," he said. "I felt more of, I don't care. I don't care about my life. I don't care about what happens to you." He smiled when he said it. That same smile he'd shown Tom and Jackie Hawks when he came to buy their boat. Tom Hawks' son Ryan attended every day of every trial. He watched the man who murdered his father and stepmother sit emotionless as witnesses described their final moments. After the sentencing, Ryan spoke to reporters. He talked about the man his father had been, the lessons he'd taught, the life he'd lived. And he shared something Tom had told him years earlier, when Ryan was just a teenager complaining about his strict upbringing. Tom had looked him in the eye and said, "You will thank me one day for the man you are yet to become." Tom Hawks spent his career believing that people could change, that even the worst among us deserved a second chance. Skylar Delian proved him wrong. Some people are simply born with something missing inside them, some darkness that no amount of compassion can reach, some void where a conscience should be. The well-deserved sat in dry storage for years after the trials, wrapped in plastic, preserved as evidence. Eventually, it was released to Tom and Jackie's sons. They sold it. They had to. Some dreams, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. The anchor weighed 60 pounds. That's what they used to take 2 lives, a lifetime of savings, and a grandfather's chance to hold his grandchild. Skylar DeLeon sits on death row today. He's undergone gender transition while incarcerated and now identifies as Skylar Preciosa DeLeon. But the name doesn't matter. The smile doesn't matter. The childhood trauma doesn't matter. What matters is this. Somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, a retired probation officer and the woman he loved are still together, still holding hands, forever. Tom Hawks was 57 years old. Jackie Hawks was 47. They are survived by Tom's sons, Ryan and Matt, and the grandson Jackie never got to meet.